Любой вояка недоумок, понимаешь? Если, если мужская особь соглашается с войной, значит она очень тупая, понимаешь? Да, 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 то есть, уж простите, как бы кажется. Да, 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 да. И трусливая, кстати, да. Нет, не трусливая, с физической расправой связано. Хотя это тоже, наверное. Может, наоборот. Проще, потому что себя убить. Водкой напоить чем-нибудь там, или натренировать, загипнотизировать, или берсерк, там, не знаю. Чем, да, тем, что ты хреносос в этом обществе, то есть тем, что со своей слабостью, с недоумочностью, чем служить своей жизни. Как, чем, да, чем жить жизнь мужчины. Да. Человек, ну, то есть человек мужской особи, так скажем, да. Столкнуться со своим характером, да, с признанием и так далее. Потому что ну, объем работы всего лишь. Поэтому проще быть солдафоном, которого физически тренируют, как динозавра какого-то, и отправляют на бой. Но мне это не касается, меня это не волнует. За то, чтобы люди получали тройные зарплаты, которые они не заслуживают. В этой части света, относительно других частей света, да. Халяве, дармоедению этих же жлобов. Таких же недоумков. Меня не касается. Ну, это не суть разговора. Ну, общество, да, никто ни за что не ответит, понимаешь? Самая беда. Понимаешь? Таракан вылез, думал, самый умный. Все. Вот это он был. Ну, он про себя так думает только. Не надо, говорить ничего не надо, я имею в виду, что это самое. Ну, это тоже не надо. Ну да. Видишь, ну у всех голова работает. Если ты согласишься с этим тезисом, что можно, ну да, что война от халявы происходит, от неведения, ну да, ну это не суть разговора. То есть от недоумства мужиков, да, от жадности это как часто, ну может по-разному, это все одно и то же. То есть, да, да, от того, что все плохо живут своей жизнью, мужские и женские, скажем, да. Ну, это не важно, за всех не надо говорить. То есть, а то, что война не имеет оправдания, в ней участвовать не имеет никакого смысла, никакого оправдания тому, что ты на такое дно упал, и ты служишь какой-то воякой там, а еще. Этому оправдания нет. Становись мужчиной, как говорится, да. Работай над собой, получай специально, наверное, да. Понимаешь? Она у тебя одна единственная. Может, ты какой-нибудь сделаешь лекарство, черт его знает. Понимаешь? Но ты нужен. И своей родне, и своим и роду людскому, им как, да, они это самое. Они, как вот ты объяснишь-то, что человек это не кусок мяса, который можно что-то заткнуть. Понимаешь? Ты не понимаешь, что ли, это настолько. Северный Кореец, что ли, он тебя просто понял уже. Ну вот это. Тебе не все. Ну и что ты хочешь? Ты хочешь чужими словами оправдаться, что ли? Наоборот, ну ладно. Ну значит нету его просто все. Нет, я себе так думаю. Да. Я ничего не имею против этого, но я в этом участвую. Ну то есть как бы, ну вот есть, и что дальше? Давайте не будем просто-то. Простите, ладно. Но тебя хотят сделать виноватым, понимаешь? Да, ну вот оно это имеет в виду, да, что это сделаешь. и не сеять мира, судя по это он есть самый, да. Сеять войну и страх, ненависть и бедность, слава. Ну как-то нехорошо, ладно, как плохо все. Видишь, вот как бы на самом деле вот так вот происходит, понимаешь? Ты почему мне сейчас можешь говорить и чувствовать себя как бы правым, потому что я как бы, ну, безработный, с таким, сижу на шее у родителей, как бы, да, скажем так. Фактически, да. То есть, да, ты мне можешь сказать, да ты там слабак, там, да, ну и как бы действительно так. То есть, ну что я тебе могу сказать, вот, и типа это, взять за рога тебя и повезти в армию куда-нибудь или еще что-нибудь, да. Что я тебе могу сказать в ответ? То есть, я отработаю, знаешь? Потому что, да, у меня нет намерения сидеть на шее или просто жрать быт какой-то, или просто бухать и отдыхать, праздновать. У меня есть, да, у меня свои амбиции какие-то, может они какие-то, это не важно даже. То есть, ну, это уже тебя не касается, в принципе, да. Ну, отработать, то есть реально общество просто, ну, то есть какие-то зарплаты. Ну, не общество, давай не будем сейчас. Общество, то есть просто работаю, что ты мне тут рассказываешь? Да. То есть вот это вот не надо. Просто, да, то есть. Ну, то есть ты в какой-то момент ты просто не сможешь сказать. Это как вот, понимаешь, как это, как он про это и говорил, да. Ну, наоборот. Ну, это, ну вот не, да, он про себя так думает. Да. Ну, вот наоборот, значит, да. Да. Ну, наверное, это не то, что вот обид просто, ну, наверное, да. Ну, тут негде быть неправым, к сожалению, понимаешь? Я понимаю, что такое тема. Ну, вот наоборот, да, ты меня хочешь повинить в том, чего я даже не делал и не думал и так далее. Ну, хорошо, я повинюсь. Для чего это тебе? И что дальше? И... То есть, как бы, смысл-то в чем? Для чего ты это делаешь? Чего вы это говорите? Мне, да, понимаете, даже знаю. Скажем по-другому, если бы никто не шел на войну, они бы сейчас все были живы. У меня бы сейчас было еще троюродных братьев, шматьев, у меня 10 человек, у прабабушки умерло просто. Ну, да, понимаешь? Неважно. Я понимаю, да, понимаю, то есть убивала на войнах просто, понимаешь? Сейчас была бы, и кто знает, может и меня было бы меньше тогда. Потому что не надо, есть такой трендец, я тоже наблюдаешь, да, что скорее всего наоборот. Все, что говорит, то есть, то, что говорят на поверхности, ну неважно, но он это имел в виду, да, ну ладно, это ни о чем не говорит, ну да, наоборот, только да, потихоньку как-то, не знаю, что ли, да, не знаю, да, ну вот наоборот, специально, да, ну ладно. То есть это проще, чем конкурировать, проще, чем быть мужчиной, короче, да, по-настоящему, то есть быть мужчиной. Наоборот, так он это имеет, да. Эволюционно, то есть не гамадрил, он это понимает. Ну чё, да не надо, понимаешь? Жить хорошо. Наверное, только так, да. Вот это есть. Чувствует себя правым. Это я про себя все pensé. Ну нет, ну вот наоборот, да. Нет, не правым, короче. Какая разница? Понимаешь, вот правда, ну, в том штука, что вот... Ладно, есть еще, понимает, ладно. Горкуша, горкуша вот так и все. Да. Береги себя буквально, да, понимаете, да, уважайте свое тело, потому что тело, в теле есть жизнь. Да, понимаете. Да, хотя бы ради родителей, маму, да, понимаете. Да, да, понимаете. Не имеешь права просто, да. Как же, представляешь, там, древо предков, там, ну просто я так уж это говорю, наверное, да. Да, понял. Жить надо, короче, жить надо. Работать надо, да. Все хорошо, короче. C'è
nato a Roma nel 1752 e morto a Evesham, in Inghilterra, nel 1832. Compositore, a detta di tutti i grandi musicologi, sottostimato, decisamente sottostimato. È stato un grande pianista, è stato... Nato a Roma nel 1752 e morto a Evesham, in Inghilterra, nel 1832. Compositore, a detta di tutti i grandi musicologi, sottostimato, decisamente sottostimato. È stato un grande pianista, è stato forse il primo grande pianista moderno, il primo compositore che ha dedicato al pianoforte non solo la sua competenza tecnica, ma anche la sua capacità espressiva. Vincenzo Vitale lo paragona a Cherubini, questa sua severità nella scrittura, questa sua capacità di conoscere non solo lo strumento dal punto di vista tecnico, come dicevo prima, ma anche lo strumento dal punto di vista espressivo. Il brano che sentirete di Muzio Clementi, lento e patetico, per il secondo movimento della sonata in fa diesis minore, è per esempio un brano estremamente espressivo che fa parte di una sonata che Vladimir Horowitz ha portato in giro per il mondo, ha registrato. Horowitz è stato uno dei grandi estimatori di Clementi, così come tanti altri compositori e tanti altri pianisti dopo Clementi. Pensiamo a Maria Tipo, che ha pensato di presentare non solo le sue prime sonate in edizione, ma anche le sue composizioni minori, come i valzer, le Monferrine, eccetera. Ma pensiamo anche appunto a pianisti della scuola di Italia, come Michele Campanella, Laura De Fusco, eccetera, che parteciparono alla incisione per primi di tutta l'opera del Gradus al Parnassum, i suoi 100 studi per pianoforte. Oggi c'è, che sta ultimando quest'opera, Alessandro Marangoni. Io stesso nel 1975 ho esordito in campo discografico con un LP per Ario nel Ducale di studi tratti dal Gradus al Parnassum di Clementi, eseguendo tra l'altro in questi studi 2 suite, perché il Gradus al Parnassum conteneva non solo i famosi 23 studi che si suonavano all'esame di compimento medio e che poi oggi sono odiati da gran parte di quelli che nella nuova riforma li hanno eliminati, secondo me in maniera negativa, perché sono molto utili, perché sono 23 studi uguali per tutti, e molto utili perché sono di tecnica diversa, scelti da Casella agli inizi del Novecento, ma sicuramente molto di tecnica diversa, scelti da Casella agli inizi del Novecento, ma sicuramente molto importanti. Ma soprattutto è anche perché questi studi erano la raccolta del Gradus, conteneva fughe a doppio soggetto, adagi, composizioni molto espressive, insomma, che nei 23 sono quasi tutte sparite, c'è solo un adagio, nei 23 non ci sono comunque fughe, ma che nei 100 del Gradus ci sono. Pensate che Arturo Benedetto Michelangeli nei suoi corsi di perfezionamento faceva lavorare il primo di questi studi, che è uno studio sui ribattuti, prima semplici, poi doppi, poi tripli, che è molto utile per l'indipendenza di ogni singolo dito. Detto questo, Clementi ha avuto una vita straordinaria. Pensate che aveva 14 anni, il padre era reggentiere presso il Vaticano a Roma, un nobile inglese, Peter Beckford, lo ascoltò in una esibizione, ancora giovanissimo, e decise di chiedere al padre, e lo ottenne, di prendere Clementi, di adottare Clementi, di portarselo in Inghilterra, farlo studiare nel suo castello. In cambio avrebbe dovuto suonare per gli amici che il nobile invitava a casa sua per 7 anni, e quindi fino a che non ebbe la capacità di assimilare perfettamente la tecnica pianistica e la capacità dello strumento di esprimersi, Clementi stette per 7 anni con quest'uomo, visse con lui come se fosse stato un secondo padre, fu firmato un contratto tra l'altro, e all'età di 18 anni poté esibirsi per la prima volta in un concerto dove ebbe così tanto successo che cominciò a diventare veramente uno dei grandi pianisti d'Inghilterra. Talmente grande che la sua prima tournée del 1781 gli si chiese da parte dell'imperatore di Vienna di fare un duello con Wolfgang Mozart. Il duello fu fatto, ovviamente Mozart in tutte le sue lettere parlò malissimo di Clementi, dicendo che era solo tecnica, che si preoccupava dello strumento solo della parte virtuosistica e non della parte espressiva. Però si sa che l'imperatore fu costretto a dare come voto finale la parità, perché Mozart era grande all'epoca, ma anche Clementi era un grande pianista. E non solo, successe anche un'altra cosa strana che voi sicuramente sapete, la sonata in si bemolle, che comincia con un si do, con questo andamento armonico e ritmico uguale al flauto magico, all'inizio del flauto magico di Mozart, fu composto da Clementi quasi, diciamo, 6-7 anni prima che Mozart decidesse di scrivere il flauto magico. Quindi vuol dire che Mozart, nonostante tutte le cose terribili che diceva, che scriveva nelle sue lettere, magari pensava che queste lettere non sarebbero mai state lette se non dagli amici o dal padre o dalla madre, eccetera, o dalla sorella, e nonostante queste cose fu costretto in qualche modo a tenere presente questo tema così straordinario che gli diede la possibilità di creare l'incipit di una delle sue opere più importanti. Clementi fu anche costruttore di pianoforti, una sua prima fabbrica di pianoforti in Inghilterra fu bruciata, per cui non poté continuare per un certo periodo la sua attività, che però venne ripresa dopo che si ritirò dalla vita concertistica e decise di diventare anche editore, costruttore di pianoforti, venditore di pianoforti. Un suo famoso viaggio a San Pietroburgo all'inizio dell'Ottocento fece sì che lo zar di San Pietroburgo decidesse di comprare diversi pianoforti di Clementi. In questo viaggio Clementi andò con John Field come assistente. Lo usava, era il suo allievo migliore, lo usava un po' come schiavo, diciamo così, come dimostratore, come un sottoposto, però John Field, noi sappiamo che ispirò addirittura con i suoi notturni anche Frédéric Chopin. Ebbe anche altri allievi importanti, tra cui Kramer. E a proposito di Kramer, sappiate che dal 1807 Clementi ottenne anche come editore la possibilità di editare le composizioni più importanti di Ludwig van Beethoven, che lo stimava tantissimo e stimava tantissimo questo lento e patetico che ascolterete.
Лёше интересно внутрь. А Насте интересно подарить то, что понравится Лёше. Но как понять, что именно? Подарите Яндекс-станцию мини. Всем интересный подарок.
Дома бывает сложно сосредоточиться. Ищите креативные решения. Находить решение просто с видеоответами в приложении Google.
Ciao a tutti, in questo video presento la mia registrazione dei 60 studi per pianoforte di Johann Baptist Kramer, scelti e riveduti da Hans von Bülow. Quest'anno, nel 2021, ricorrono i 250 anni dalla nascita di questo compositore tedesco, che praticamente tutti i pianisti conoscono in qualche misura, avendone preparato per gli esami in conservatorio almeno uno o qualcuno di questi studi. Kramer nasce l'anno dopo di Beethoven e come lui è tedesco, essendo nato a Mannheim. A differenza di Beethoven, e ancor di più di molti grandi musicisti legati al pianoforte, come Schubert, Chopin, Mendelssohn, Schumann, ebbe una vita molto lunga, morendo all'età di 87 anni, che per l'epoca, considerata la vita media di allora, era un traguardo notevolissimo. Kramer è stato un compositore assai prolifico, ma molte sue composizioni sono cadute nell'oblio, anche se sicuramente meriterebbero di essere riscoperte, specialmente alcune sonate per pianoforte, che a parer mio sono molto interessanti e molto belle. Gli originari 84 studi per pianoforte, disposti in 2 volumi, sono stati composti tra il 1804 ed il 1810 e forse sono il suo lascito artistico più considerevole. Nella prefazione alla prima edizione degli stessi studi, Kramer dichiarava che aveva composto questi lavori per agevolare i progressi di coloro che vogliono studiare severamente il pianoforte. Kramer era tedesco, come abbiamo detto, ma visse tra l'Inghilterra e la Francia, prevalentemente a Londra, dove era stato allievo di Clementi, e poi nella Parigi di Chopin. Da giovane concertista era stato riconosciuto come un grande interprete dei concerti per pianoforte e orchestra di Mozart ed era anche stato apprezzato pubblicamente dallo stesso Beethoven, che certamente conosceva bene i suoi lavori, così come abbiamo contezza del fatto che lo stesso Chopin, che era ben 40 anni più giovane di Kramer, conoscesse e facesse suonare questi studi ai suoi allievi durante le lezioni di pianoforte. Su Kramer, tuttavia, è necessario aggiungere che, nonostante la sua longevità, sia l'attività di pianista sia quella di compositore in realtà si collocano in un periodo piuttosto limitato. Ecco, cosa accade? Quando in pieno Ottocento si affacciarono al mondo i nuovi grandi musicisti romantici, il nostro compositore, che era conosciuto in Inghilterra come Johann il Glorioso, praticamente preferì ritirarsi a vita privata. Hans von Bülow, eccellente pianista e soprattutto grande direttore d'orchestra dell'Ottocento, specialmente legato a Wagner e anche a Franz Liszt, di cui tra l'altro era il genero, avendone sposato la figlia Cosima. Ecco, Hans von Bülow ripubblicò gli studi di Kramer e ne operò una complessiva revisione, cambiandone l'ordine, aggiungendo le sue stesse diteggiature e commentandoli opportunamente. Come dice Piero Rattalino, questi studi sono una miniera di idee musicali pianistiche che provengono dalla tecnica classica e si sviluppano in brani di dimensioni ridotte. Molti studi durano solo 1 minuto o poco più e la mia stessa esecuzione integrale di tutti i 60 dura circa 1 ora e un quarto. Ma essi, gli studi, aggiunge Rattalino, sono strutturalmente ed esteticamente perfetti. Adolf von Henselt, che era un grandissimo pianista tedesco che operò prevalentemente in Russia nella seconda metà dell'Ottocento, operò come didatta ed ispettore ministeriale per l'istruzione musicale, contribuì in modo rilevante a diffondere gli studi di Kramer, curandone anche una sua trascrizione per 2 pianoforti. Nella trascrizione di Henselt, il primo pianoforte suona lo studio così come esso è scritto, mentre il secondo pianoforte suona i corali a 4 parti, che sono il telaio armonico sottostante agli stessi studi. Questa considerazione è opportuna per sottolineare che la base armonica dello studio di Kramer è il corale organistico figurato, che ovviamente si ricollega esattamente a Johann Sebastian Bach, di cui il nostro Kramer era un fervente ammiratore e possiamo dire in questo senso anche un fedele discepolo. Questi studi, aggiunge Piero Rattalino, emanano un sottile ed intenso profumo di arte. Purtroppo, aggiungiamo noi, sono ingiustamente legati solo agli esami in conservatorio, ma la musica ovviamente non si può e non si deve identificare in modo così esclusivo solo con gli esami. E quello che vorrei, forse immodestamente, sottolineare con questa mia interpretazione è che questi brani sono pieni di vita e molti di essi raggiungono sicuramente delle vette artistiche davvero elevate. Posso infine aggiungere di aver iniziato lo studio di Kramer nel 1993, quando preparavo il mio stesso esame di 5º anno di pianoforte. Infine aggiungerei che in Italia, ecco, la diffusione tra 800 e 900 degli studi con i commenti e le annotazioni tradotte in italiano si deve agli editori Carisch nella rivisitazione di Bruno Mugellini ed alle edizioni Curci con i lievi ritocchi e i nuovi commenti di Alessandro Longo. Mugellini e Alessandro Longo furono 2 grandi didatti del pianoforte a cavallo tra 800 e 900. Bene, alla mia registrazione ho aggiunto lo spartito da poter seguire per chi legge la musica e quindi specialmente per gli studenti di pianoforte, ma ovviamente chiunque può avvicinarsi a questi ascolti. In descrizione ho inserito per ciascuno studio il momento esatto in cui inizia, così da poter cliccare ed ascoltare esattamente lo studio o gli studi che interessano tra i 60, ma ovviamente se volete ascoltarli tutti mi sento di dire che può essere, o almeno spero che possa essere, 1 ora e un quarto ben spesa. Vi invito infine a cliccare mi piace ed ad iscrivervi al mio canale YouTube, dove troverete molte altre mie interpretazioni al pianoforte. Vi auguro infine buon ascolto ed insieme a voi auguro buon 250° compleanno a Johann Baptist Kramer. Grazie mille per l'ascolto e arrivederci.
Я прошу тебя помочь им дышать.
Самое то, самое то. Вот это и есть он самый, да. Ну, что ночью, чтобы сидеть здесь, да, вообще нахер. Ну и че? Ну вот наоборот, да наоборот. Ну наоборот, значит, да наоборот. Да, да, вот это есть. Да наоборот. Да.
One of the most prominent arguments to defend, so to speak, the single-beat metronome theory is the claim that musicians over the course of the 19th century somewhere started to play way slower than, let's say, Beethoven or Czerny indicated. It's a claim that is just an opinion, since there is not a single 19th century line that backs this up. But musicologists of today need to stick to that opinion, since there is no other way for them to explain the extremely fast metronome numbers of Beethoven and contemporaries, tempi that even the earliest acoustical recordings almost never seem to reach. That single beat theory, in case you're new here to the channel, is the assumption to read metronome numbers, roughly say those from Beethoven, Chopin and others, in the same way as we do today. So, one tick equals the note value of the metronome equation. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's called single beat. This view, heavily supported by the academic world of today, has a direct consequence. The refusal to even start to look into the historical ways of measuring time or tempi, where two ticks form a binary unity, like 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, is that today almost nobody anymore looks into the thousands of tempo indications our beloved composers originally gave for their music. It's one of those things you can reflect on for hours and days even, thinking just how on earth this is possible. In this episode, the closing of a series of 4 on the famous pianist and teacher Isidore Philippe, we will see that in his 1891 edition of Clementi's Gradus ad Parnassum, he proves exactly the opposite. Tempi did not decrease throughout the 19th century, but instead accelerated, and not by a little. So stay with me a few minutes, since this is an important topic that I would like to present to you with a little bit of context. Once musicians or musicologists descend the stairs of tempi and metronome theory to prove their claims are correct, some argumentation comes to the surface that factor is easy to refute, but yet broadly accepted by the academic world of musicologists. It seems as if many musicians and researchers do see the problem of the hundreds, if not thousands, of problematic metronome numbers, often technically simply impossible, but that they, no matter what, keep their critical eyes closed for true researching this topic, no matter what the consequences are. The obvious consequence is that tempi in the early 19th century were way slower than we believe today, and my feeling is that no musicologist at an academic level wants to be the first to make this statement. A famous argument you hear often also is that those 19th century metronome numbers were in fact never meant to be played, that these musicologists have closed their eyes to debunk something as easy as this claim has huge implications. It has led to a performance practice in which basically all musicians, those connected to the early music movement included, in fact rarely, if ever, even look to the original tempo indications composers gave for their own music. That means directly that you and I have never heard in our entire lives performances of the music we admired played in a way the composers might have done it themselves. That is not Wim Winters who claims this to be true, that's a simple fact. Our choice of tempo affects every single aspect of our performance. Changing tempo is changing everything, including the character of the piece, which for a composer would be a nightmare. If Beethoven asked questions to people who attended concerts with his music, his first and most important question always was, how was the tempo? He even once fulminated that he would leave out the metronome numbers, since no musician paid attention to them anyway. That's another quote completely taken out of context today, reframing it as if even Beethoven did not take his own metronome numbers serious. Even though also that claim is simple to debunk by just looking to the important metronome numbers the master left us after this moment of frustration, we today fear the consequence of it. And the consequence would be to leave our basements and accept the metronome numbers as they are shining silver living objects, surviving time in a way that is remarkable. Take your metronome, put it on 138 and let it tick. You will be hearing exactly the same as Beethoven heard when he metronomized his Hammerklavier Sonata. If you've never given this a serious thought, then imagine this picture of Beethoven, possibly still in his dressing gown, searching the right number on his metronome. A personal gift from Menzel, by the way, to match the tempo in which he was at that moment playing his famous sonata. How cool is that? I mean, how much closer do you want to come to those composers and musicians? It is as if our fingertips reach those of Beethoven. So think about the fact of why the musicological world, in fact, does not want you and me to think for ourselves on this topic too much. Yes, for metronome numbers of Beethoven we at least in theory have some respect, as for those of Chopin, at least on paper, since activate your metronome app on your phone and spend an afternoon on YouTube checking recordings randomly to the composer's own tempo indications and you will be shocked. Now, It's not my purpose, and it never will be to convince you to change your playing or listening habits. There's absolutely nothing wrong in playing music by Beethoven or Chopin the way you want, as there is absolutely nothing wrong in listening to the recordings you like, since music is emotion, and as I said before, we have been told our entire lives that if Polini plays Chopin or Steyer plays Mozart, we hear the voices of the past. So yes, to that sound, even if it turns out to be a 20th century instead of an historical sound, we are emotionally attached. And there's nothing wrong with that. Even if it turns out that Beethoven and Chopin were no Olympic gods as performing musicians, but humans after all, it shouldn't prevent you to keep pushing limits in your own pianistic life to match an abstract point of technical power beyond the horizon. I know many pianists that get their daily energy simply from the idea they will not in this lifetime reach the level that they think is set for them by people like Chopin or Liszt. And I'm not saying this ironically, but serious. And having been in Amsterdam Conservatory for 8 years, I know that attitude, that idea of reaching for the unreachable, driven by a true respect for what almost everyone thoughtlessly accepts to be the standards of the past, that attitude brings out the best in many musicians. Hence the superb, often simply stunning results on the stages of today. Compare what pianists do today to what was common a century ago, and you'll see that history is always formed around progress. We don't become worse, we become better, at least in aspects of technical power. That brings us back directly to our point of departure. With all the pianistic power that we have available today, simply look at the Queen Elizabeth competition here in Belgium. It is safe to say that if the historical metronome numbers indeed were to be read as we do today, so in single beat, Beethoven or Chopin outperformed all of those competitors with their fingers in their nose. I'm aware of how ridiculous that claim sounds. It indeed is hard to imagine that if the absolute top pianists of today would go back in history, that Beethoven would technically make them sound like beginners. And yet, if we hold on to our claim that those historical tempo indications are to be read in our modern way, instead of the historical metrical way, yes, then we must conclude that we somehow lost a serious portion of pianistic power that apparently was still available to humans living 2 centuries ago. People claim to play the Hammerklavier Sonata in Beethoven's tempo, but if you check, they actually don't. And to make things a little bit clearer than that, the Hammerklavier is extremely fast in single beat, as is the fugue, by the way, of the same sonata. But compared to dozens, if not hundreds of etudes written in the same period by the virtuosos of those days, the Hammerklavier suddenly becomes even moderate. Czerny wants you to play 19 notes a second in his daily exercises, with the explicit demand that you end playing according to his metronomic indication. Yes, you as a reader of his preface, not Mr. Alien from Krypton, and don't feel bad about not being able to do this. No living human can, could, or ever will. So what to do with those metronome indications? Accepting the obvious connection to the old terminology of beat, or in German Schlag, leads to a completely new look on our classical music. I demonstrate again, simple as what? 1, 2, 3, 4. Being described in the 16th and 17th century times after time. So, the musicologists who would officially make that connection, where not one tick represents the note value in the metronome equation, but again the binary unity of 2, he or she would force musicians of today to completely reinvent their performance practice. And honestly, I believe it takes more courage and risk than our present academic world allows. Since yes, one runs into questions or theory, and yes, one runs into questions that might not be always easy to answer. But but skipping the silver shining elements of proof, which are the metronome numbers itself, is a risk or is a thing that we simply would not allow ourselves to do. But yeah, people don't like change. Our croc brain is activated immediately with the question, what will happen if? And certainly also that question pops up in the brains of our musicologists who are thinking on the same tempo issue as we are doing now. Anyway, seeing these incredibly high metronome numbers, at least if read as we do today, an obvious question comes to mind. How come that we today generally play slower, in some cases even much slower? If it were true, it would be the absolute single domain of history in which humanity chooses the path of going slower instead of faster. Certainly in the age of mechanization, an absolute belief in progress, it should raise eyebrows that in the pianistic evolution, and basically in any type of instrument, despite of the bigger, more powerful and stronger pianos that companies kept inventing, musicians somehow mysteriously choose to play slower. Also that pianists over the course of the 19th century mysteriously lost that unique technical capacity, at least according to what musicologists apparently make us believe today, to play in speeds up to 800, 900 or even 1150 notes per minute. What you will see is that of this three-part deduction, namely 1. Original metronome numbers indications are extremely fast, unplayable often. 2. Current tempi of even our greatest virtuosos are slower, sometimes way slower than those metronome indications. And 3, conclusion, tempi must have been faster 2 centuries ago, and thus music slowed down over the 19th century. That typically the first point is left out. So instead of 3 points, you'll hear only 2. 1. Current tempi of even our greatest virtuosos are slower, sometimes way slower than early 19th century metronome numbers. So, conclusion, tempi must have been faster 2 centuries ago, and thus music slowed down over the 19th century. And suddenly we have the feel that there is a solution for musicians who trust the outcomes of this tempo research, and they don't ask questions anymore. Case closed. We will come back to the subject, since there are lots of 19th century sources covering the period 1820-1900 that make completely the opposite point. But let's stick here to the edition Isidore Philippe made in 1891 of the Clementi Grados at Parnassum. If tempi really became slower throughout the 19th century, he would at maximum not change the original Clementi tempi, who already are extremely high and in many cases simply impossible. But he didn't. He added his own tempo indications, and now the burning question is, are they slower, confirming the academic standpoint of today, or faster? I guess you know the answer by now. Let's have a look together. So of course this one score cannot stand up as a proof for the entire, but it is a rare example of an editor, in this case a world-famous pianist of his time, adding faster tempo indications to the original Clementi ones, and thereby proving the opposite of what musicology today claims to be true. Tempi did not slow down throughout the entire up as a proof for So of course this one score cannot stand up as a proof for the entire, but it is a rare example of an editor, in this case a world-famous pianist of his time, adding faster tempo indications to the original Clementi ones, and thereby proving the opposite of what musicology today claims to be true. Tempi did not slow down. Throughout the entire 19th century, they went up. I believe Isidore Philippe is an important historical figure, and I guess the last thing has not been said from him. The fact that he confirmed his own tempo indications several times, and that those tempo indications or metronome numbers are only to be understood from the standpoint of the historical metrical reading of the metronome is remarkable, and installs another cornerstone in our tempo research. If you've missed those previous episodes, simply click on the thumbnail over here, or click on the story on Beethoven's Fifth Symphony over there. If you like what you saw and want to see more series like this, becoming a member of our Patreon community would help tremendously. Link below and in the description box. As for now, thanks for watching. See you soon again. Bye.
Clementi today, and he's a pretty unknown, well, he's not unknown, he's a pretty underrated classical music composer. And if you are not a piano player, like if you're a violinist or something like that, you're probably not going to be familiar with him because he's mainly just known for his piano music. So what we're going to talk about today is his life, his history. We've already kind of said that. We're going to talk about his musical contributions, what he did for the development of the piano, what his playing style was like, and as always, some fun little anecdotes and quotes. So let's get started. So first of all, some basic details. Clementi was born in 1752, which was 2 years after the death of Bach. That helps you out at all, gives you a little bit of a sense of perspective. And he lived until 1832 to the respectable age of 80. He was born in Rome, Italy, but spends the majority of his life in England, particularly London. Muzio Clementi's father, Niccolo, noticed Clementi's musical talents when he was super young. They actually had a relative who was the music director at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Italy. So Niccolo was like, hey, do you mind giving my son some keyboard lessons so he can develop his talent? By the time Clementi was 7, he began more formal instruction. He learned how to sing, and he studied figured bass, which in modern days is basically like the equivalent of learning how to improvise chords on the piano. Figured bass was the Baroque style. Basically, we're looking at what were essentially chord symbols, and so the figured bass performer would read these notes in the bass line, and then these numbers symbolize what chords they are. By age 11, he was learning counterpoints, which was another Baroque style staple. Basically, counterpoints is when there's more than one melody or tune being played at the same time, so it's a difficult style to play. And when Clementi was 13, he had already composed an oratorio and a mass, which are these huge scale vocal and instrumental works. So basically, your takeaway here is that he was a child genius. Since people tended to start careers very young back in the day, Clementi became the organist at a Rome church, the Damaso Church in San Lorenzo, and he was only 14 years old at the time. That was in 1766. He didn't keep that job for long, though, since he ended up getting swooped away to England. In 1766, there was this man named Sir Peter Beckford, who traveled to Rome and happened upon Clementi. He saw that Clementi was super talented, and he decided he wanted to bring Clementi back with him to England. And since Beckford was pretty independently wealthy, like he had family who were in prominent positions, I think he had a cousin who was a mayor. Basically, he talked to Clementi's dad, and he said, okay, well, here's the deal. If Clementi gets to come to England with me and serve as the musical entertainment at my estate, which is north of Blandford Forum in England, I will give you quarterly payments to sponsor his education until he reaches age 21. And his dad was game for that, and I guess Clementi was game for that too. So he ended up working for Beckford for 7 years until he was 21 years old, as agreed upon. And during this time, Clementi apparently spent like 8 hours a day at the harpsichord, and he practiced composers like Bach and Bach's son, C.B.E. Bach, Handel, Scarlatti, and other Baroque staples. Once he was freed from his musical obligations to Beckford, Clementi moved to London in 1774, where he did like conducting and he performed as a harpsichordist. And by the end of the 1770s, he was pretty well known. So that in 1780, he actually went on tour and he visited European cities such as Paris and Vienna. So in Paris, he had the honor of performing for Marie Antoinette. But it was in Vienna where he had his infamous duel with Mozart. Not a fistfight duel, though, sorry to disappoint you, but it was a musical duel, which is also pretty awesome. They were at a party of the Viennese Emperor Joseph II, and Joseph II thought it would be a really fun idea to pit Mozart and Clementi against each other in a musical battle. So the way it worked is they were each required to play something that they wrote and do like improvisation. And then I assume that awesomeness ensued and they both like set fire to the keyboard with their crazy skills because Joseph II declared both of their skills so great that a tie had to be declared. Mozart, however, was not pleased with that, and this is what he wrote to his father. Clementi never played well, as far as execution with the right hand goes. His greatest strength lies in his passages in thirds, but apart from that, he is not a cruiser's worth of taste or feeling. In short, he is a mere mechanus, which is a robot. So, on the other hand, Clementi had nothing but positive enthusiasm for Mozart. He must have admired Mozart's music since he made a lot of transcriptions of his music. So it's kind of a one-sided feeling there. More on the subject of Clementi and Mozart. Clementi wrote his sonata in B-flat, Opus 24, number 2 in 1770. And Mozart borrowed that tune in the overture to his opera, The Magic Flute, 10 years later in 1780. So in this day and age, that would slap Mozart with a lawsuit because of copyright infringement. But back then, musicians borrowed from each other like this all the time. And it was generally considered a compliment, not an insult. Still, Clementi felt the need to make a note of it in his publication that it was, in fact, his composition and not Mozart's. By 1783, Clementi was back in England, and he would remain there for the next 20 years where he established himself as a good teacher and performer and songwriter and conductor. There are some really interesting teacher-student lineages worth mentioning here. So one of Clementi's students was Ludwig Berger, who then went on to teach the quite famous Felix Mendelssohn. And Clementi also taught John Field, who's a relatively well-known English composer, who went on to then be a large influence on Frédéric Chopin. By the end of the 1780s, Clementi had made a name for himself by his flamboyant and really impressive virtuosic piano playing. He really liked doing lots of dazzling things, and he was a bit of I assume he was a little bit of a piano show-off, look at my amazing technique. But later in life, he kind of learned to dial it back a little bit, and that's when he started developing his really beautiful cantabile style, singing style, which would become his signature and kind of what he's known for today. So now we're going to jump ahead to 1798, when Clementi was 45 years old, and he entered the business world. He ended up taking over a publishing firm on a really prestigious shopping street in London, the address being 26 Cheapside, and he ended up opening up other offices for music publication as well, and even began manufacturing pianos. Now, this is the part where we bring in Beethoven. So Mozart was fairly critical about Clementi, not to his face, but in private letters for sure. But Beethoven felt the exact opposite. He really admired and enjoyed Clementi. So one way we know this is because Beethoven actually allowed Clementi full publishing rights to his music in England, which is no small thing. And Clementi is and was known for his sonatas and sonatinas, and Beethoven would often play them, and he passionately recommended it. I say it was passionate because it's Beethoven. He recommended Clementi's sonatas and sonatinas to many people, including his beloved nephew Karl. One of Beethoven's biographers, Anton Schindler, had this to say of the matter. Beethoven had the greatest admiration for these sonatas, considering them the most beautiful, the most pianistic of works, both for their lovely, pleasing original melodies and for the consistent, easily followed form of each movement. The musical education of his beloved nephew, Karl, was confined for many years almost exclusively to the playing of Clementi's sonatas. He also added that among all the masters who have written for piano, Beethoven assigned Clementi the very foremost rank. He considered his works excellent as studies for practice, for the formation of a pure taste, and as truly beautiful subjects for performance. Carl Czerny, who was a student of Beethoven's, also loved Clementi piano sonatas, which makes sense seeing as he was generally enthusiastic about Beethoven, and Beethoven would have taught him the sonatas. And then Czerny went on to teach the sonatas to Franz Liszt, so his music teaching lineage is kind of fun and interesting, I think. By 1810, when Clementi was 58 years old, he basically stopped performing overall, just so he could focus on writing music and building pianos. He ended up founding what is now known as the Royal Philharmonic Society, which is a group that used to feature performances from famous players and musicians, and nowadays mostly promotes programs for young musicians. So he was doing pretty well for himself. His piano business was flourishing, and he was a front runner in the innovation of the piano that we all kind of know and love today, because the harpsichord was like the keyboard instrument of choice pretty much until near the end of the 1700s, where it started becoming phased out by the piano. And Clementi was at the front of this wave, ushering in like a new piano era, and kind of out with the old harpsichord, in with the new piano. So he used both his skills as a piano player and his skills as an inventor and mechanic to further the development of the piano. Never one to retire early, Clementi decided to make a few trips to Paris, Frankfurt, Munich, Leipzig, and probably other places too, between 1816 and 1821. It was during this trip that he was featuring new compositions and he was conducting his symphonies. He went on another journey in 1826 to 27 to publish his ultimate collection of keyboard studies, which was named Gradus ad Parnassum, which basically translates to the steps to the highest part of a mountain range in Greece called Parnassus. So it's like basically talking about climbing a mountain as a metaphor for his piano studies. In 1828, he made his final public appearance at the opening concert of the Philharmonic Society, which he then officially retired from in 1830 when he was 78 years old. And then after that, he retired to Evesham, Worcestershire, and died 2 years later at the age of 80 in 1832 after a short illness. Basically, Clementi lived and died the dream. He worked hard, probably had an interesting life, though, I mean, it was a long time ago, there's a lot we don't know. And he died quickly at an old age without major health issues. He's buried at Westminster Abbey along with others such as John Field. Let's spend a minute talking about Clementi's music. He composed about 110 piano sonatas, and his Opus 36 piano sonatinas are probably the best known. They're basically standard intermediate piano repertoire. They are taught to tons of piano students. I really like teaching them too because they sound good, they make for awesome finger exercises, and they're challenging to play, but they're easy to understand. However, most of his sonatas are very, very difficult, and some say they're more difficult than Mozart's. And Mozart even himself said to his sister Nannerl that she shouldn't play Clementi's sonatas since they have huge leaps and they might ruin her natural lightness of her hands. He also composed about 20 symphonies, but they are very well known and a lot of them are just lost to the passage of time. And basically Clementi's nowadays just known for his piano music. Clementi music isn't the kind you can expect to see performed in concert halls because it's largely thought of as educational music. But there's no shortage of awesome Clementi recordings out there for you to enjoy. Aside from Beethoven and Czerny promoting Clementi music to their students, Chopin was also fond of his preludes and exercises and got his students to practice them as well. So it's good enough for me. In the famous performer video series we did recently, one of the performers we talked about was Vladimir Horowitz, who was also a big fan of Clementi's sonatas. Apparently his wife just bought him like the complete works of Clementi, and he ended up enjoying them so much that he made some recordings of the sonatas. But despite Clementi's fame and success in his day, and despite being like a front runner along with Clementi and Haydn, who were like in the same era and the same genre, Clementi was destined to a B-side fame. Even though history doesn't put Clementi in the same degree of spotlight that it puts Mozart and Haydn, he was still a critical element to the development of the classical piano style and to the development of the piano itself. He is nicknamed the father of the piano for a reason. Clementi's style has also been described as marked by a most supple touch in line passages and a most unfailing So when we as piano players are interpreting Clementi, those are three really important key points that we always have to keep in mind. Ultimately, my final word on Clementi is this. Piano man. He wrote lots of music for piano, including like everything from beginner's music to advanced music. He published piano music, he performed piano music, and he even built and manufactured pianos. So, I mean, if that doesn't make him the original piano man, I don't know what does. That's all for today's history lesson on Clementi. I hope you enjoyed this beautiful journey. I really like doing these history videos. My favorite musical subjects, a little bias towards them. So hopefully you enjoyed them as well. Thank you to make these videos possible and all of you who are watching. You can come visit on Facebook and you can also follow Patreon. So I'll catch you in the next video. I'm so bad at dance moves. Wait. No, I really can't figure this out. Okay. Great. I'm this dancer.